it's really important walking into this conversation to understand that this is just the tipping point of this conversation. This is part 2 because we really wanted to go into an educational route and talk about the things that are facts, that are truth. And as a white person, it's really important to be open to these conversations. If you're walking into this defensive, this is not going to work for you. This is a learning hour, and we hope that that this sparks conversation within your own communities, within your own homes, because conversation is where things start. At least friendly conversation is where things start. We want to make sure that we're remaining open and remaining mindful that other people have experiences beyond our own, and that's just that. So let's get started.
Welcome to the Peas in Progress podcast. Here, we'll share our experiences as a biracial millennial couple who got married in the South and what we've learned together through the current social and political climate.
All while learning to trust and love one another through what seems to be a life in transition. Welcome to our life.
I'm Brandon.
And I'm Amy Beth.
Hey friends, just a friendly notice. We want to let you know that this podcast will be adult friendly, including language and subject matter not suitable for younger ears. So if you have headphones, now would be a good time to use them.
Hi.
Hi.
You're here too. Welcome back, everybody. We're so
up?
excited. But before we get into this podcast, I just wanted to let you know that you should subscribe, because that's how you're going to best keep up with us, especially if you're listening to us on Apple.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be really great that you subscribe to this podcast. And also you can subscribe to the That Vegan Wife YouTube channel, where I also put up these sound bites from our podcast there, as well as we're working to put this up on Spotify. You can find us at Peas in Progress on Instagram. Pretty simple. And then we also have an email. It's peasinprogress@gmail.com. And I also just wanted to self-promote my email list, because I put out new content every week, and including this podcast. So I lump sum everybody together. You're going to be getting all of my valuable content as well as the podcast. So every time the podcast goes out, you're going to be first to know. And so, yeah, I'm excited about our conversation, Brandon. I feel like you have a lot to say about this. We had a lot of good conversation pre-podcast. Mm-hmm. So I'm really excited to go over this topic with you, with kind of to give a well-rounded ending to this topic of racism, because I don't feel like 2 podcasts is really enough. I feel like we're going to spark some questions. What do you think we should go? Where do you think we should go with this?
Yeah, I mean, we left off talking about just our individual experiences and also our experiences as a couple. And so it's nice with just kind of separating things, that we're going to really dive into some concepts that explain more in depth, like our experiences. Like, why does it make sense that we experience these things this way? But before I really dive into that, just kind of like talking about what prevents us from even beginning to have this conversation in the first place. I mean, we've brought up topics like, white fragility. We've brought up racism. We've brought up kind of experiences we've had with, the black or white race. And a lot of times those experiences can like really discourage us from wanting to talk with each other, whether that's because of defensiveness, whether that's because of guilt, shame, you name it. These conversations like are really hard to have. And so definitely want to dive into like what keeps us from having these conversations about racism. So like, I know what comes to mind for me, babe. Like, what comes to mind for you?
Well, I would say that it's hard as a white person to have these conversations, because you can often feel really awkward about it, because you don't want to be, I know for me, it can be awkward to ask these conversations. Even now still, some of my, like outside of our marriage, it can be awkward because I don't want to overstep boundaries. I want to make sure that I'm being respectful of culture. I want to make sure that I have that cultural humility, and that can be really hard. But once I'm in the conversation and it is rolling, I often just have to sit back and listen and ask a lot of questions, because I'm curious. And I was having a conversation not too long ago, actually, and I was asking a lot of questions, but I had to clarify my question asking, because you don't want to be question asking. You want to get to know this person, and that encompasses sharing your experience too, and giving examples from your own life. And I've had to do that even outside of our marriage. Like, a lot of my really close friends are people of color, and so we've been able to have some of these conversations very lightly. I mean, it hasn't been in depth, but it's been helpful when we have had those conversations. So, and yeah, it can be awkward in the beginning, but I think that's really what keeps me from doing it. It's just that you just want to be as respectful as possible, and that's just coming from my perspective. There's other people that could say that they don't know how to have this conversation. Maybe they're really just like fearful to let people down, or sound ignorant, or sound uneducated, or it's not something that's very comfortable for them. And so I can definitely relate with that. Not only in talking about race, there's other things that can be uncomfortable to talk about, but this is a good way for us to share that it's okay. Like, you're going to mess up in this whole trying to figure out cultural humility. So, but what about, do you have any questions on that, or did you want to share your experience?
Yeah, just to like kind of piggyback off of that, because I understand that as a white person that it can be awkward to have these conversations. And you mentioned this idea of like cultural humility, getting to truly genuinely know this other person for who they are, what they are, their culture, their ethnicity, their gender, like, and you're just curiously getting to know them with question and understanding. But then also like owning who you are as well, and like there's like an accountability to it. And so it's awkward even as a Black person to enter into those conversations for different reasons. I spoke about this idea of hypervigilance, where I'm having to constantly assess situations to make sure that I'm safe in that situation. And sometimes I have to do it multiple times within the same situation, just as things within the situation change. I know lots of words, but it makes sense. And so,
can you make it simple, babe? Please, for our listeners' sake.
I'm trying. Anyways, so when I enter into a conversation, or even like a potential conversation with a white person, and if I sense anything that's gonna make me unsafe, whether that sense is like real or unfounded, or if it's grounded in some sort of truth or experience, like that's gonna raise a wall for me. And so I'm not gonna be as open in those conversations, even though deep down inside, like, I really want you to know about who I am, so that like you don't fear me, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense.
So like there's that hypervigilance that I'm talking about. But then also like there's this kind of pressure of, oh, well, now I have to make sure that you totally understand not just my experience sometimes, but like the experience of Blackness in general. Like there's this kind of fear of accountability of, well, great, now I'm going to have to like teach you all of history, all about my ancestry, all about, everything. And like, I have to be like your Black Wikipedia for a moment. Like that's a really big pressure.
That's not even fair to ask that of any person, to be the spokesperson of said group of people, because everyone has their own experience within that group, which doesn't always fit the stereotype that's portrayed on the media or wherever else you see that, or just if you see it. I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, I know some of that is bias. I mean, some of those experiences are founded in truth. I mean, I've had conversations with white people and have left feeling hurt because either they teased my experience, like, just for the fun of it, or I didn't get a sense that they really heard me. Like, it just kind of like went in one ear and out the other.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes.
I want to define bias, because sometimes it's nice to hear a definition of a word that we don't know. So bias, the Googled... Yes, I Googled this. The Googled definition for bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. The end.
Yeah, so I have this bias that they're gonna expect me to have to like teach them everything about my race, and that somehow in this conversation they're gonna hurt me. So like I'm already carrying these two biases. Some of it is founded by some of my experience, but like I would say a majority of the time for me, like that bias is there, and that's something I really have to keep in check. Then you mentioned prejudice, these kind of like what would you say the Google definition of prejudice is?
It is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience.
Yes. So here I am talking to white people, and there's this prejudice like I'm going to get hurt somehow. Like it hasn't even happened yet. The conversation hasn't even begun yet. Without really having an experience to make that make sense, I should not have these prejudices against like white people. But because again, like this kind of historical, systemic passing down of like these stereotypes and prejudices, like I too was infected. And so that's something else that I have to keep in check.
I would say that assumptions is another thing that comes in the way of these kind of conversations. From the white perspective, the white girl Amy Beth perspective, because like I said, everyone's experience is a lot different. But it's safe to assume that a lot of white people, I've been told this recently actually by someone else of white descent, that white people view Black culture as violent, that there's that assumption there. And so that's another reason that people might not have this conversation. And then rigidity. So I've seen this a lot within an older generation that is more rigid on their beliefs and their values. And I'm not talking about like old people. I'm just talking about people that are older than me who were, I think, just old, the generation that's older than millennials. I would say that they have a rigidity about them, about politics and about just views in general, especially within the Christian church. There's a lot of rigidity. So church people can be very rigid about their beliefs and about their values and about assumptions of people. So those kind of go together, in my opinion. But what do you think? What is that like on your end?
Like the rigidity can look anything from, that can't be true because you're Black. Like you make these like very hard assumptions, or you make these like unbending truths about like the way life should be. And so even though I'm presenting contradicting evidence, aka my life, my experience, like you still for whatever reason are holding true to like that belief. Race is an evolving social idea that was created to legitimize racial inequality and protect white advantage. The term white first appeared in colonial law in the late 1600s. By 1790, people were asked to claim their race on the census, and by 1825, the perceived degrees of blood determined who would be classified as Indian. From the late 1800s through the early 20th century, as waves of immigrants entered the United States, the concept of a white race was solidified. When slavery in the United States was abolished in 1865, whiteness remained profoundly important as legalized racist exclusion and violence against African Americans continued in new forms. To have citizenship, and the right citizenship imbued, you had to be legally classified as white. People with non-white racial classifications began to petition the courts to be reclassified. Now the courts were in the position to decide who was white and who was not. For example, Armenians won their case to be reclassified as whites with the help of a scientific witness who claimed that they were scientifically Caucasian. In 1922, the Supreme Court ruled that the Japanese could not be legally white because they were scientifically classified as Mongoloid. A year later, the court stated that Asian Indians were not legally white, even though they were also scientifically reclassified as Caucasian. To justify these contradictory rulings, the court stated that being white was based on the common understanding of the white man. In other words, people already seen as white got to decide who was white.
Well, Brandon, what kind of definitions do you have?
Well, the one that I would like to start off with is systemic racism. And according to Mr. Google or Mrs. Google, according to Google,
I Googled it. You can just call me that. That can be my podcast name. Mrs. Giggle here with...
Yeah, no. So systemic racism is the institutional racism is distinguished from racial bigotry by the existence of institutional systemic policies, practices, and economic and political structures which place minority racial and ethnic groups at a disadvantage in relation to an institution's racial or ethnic majority. So,
Whoa, that's a lot of words. Can you please elaborate and explain or give an example?
Yes, so to break this down in a way that makes more sense, because that was a bunch of big words for no damn reason. So a system or a way of being is put in place in some sort of like power position, so like a company or the government. And whatever that policy or that thing is, doesn't necessarily benefit minorities. So for instance, if you remember from the last episode, we talked about an instance in Black Bottom, where for whatever reason, whites in that town, like surrounding White Bottom, felt that blacks didn't deserve to be there. And so there are these policies and like ways of being that were in place that could force black people out even through violence and not receive a penalty for it. So this is kind of like an example of systemic racism in that there's a use of this power position, a system, a government, a place of power to pretty much push a rule or push a policy that benefits them as white people. And it doesn't necessarily benefit others very much, if not at all.
Now what?
Well, what you know about white privilege?
What you know about white privilege?
What you know about white privilege?
Well, Mrs. Google says that the fact of people with white skin having advantages in society that other people do not have. The concept of white privilege explains why white people have greater access to society's legal and political institutions. This is come into play in my life many a time. I have been in places where I have seen people of color get treated differently than me, and it bothers me. And this even happened not too long ago in our own grocery store. Our checkout lady, she just treated Brandon so much differently. Like, she wouldn't even look at him. Like, I remember she didn't even look him in the eye. She looked at me directly in the eyes. She didn't look at him at all. And so that's really minute, but that's really real and also really rude, because we are social human beings and eye contact is a huge outer language for us. And so making eye contact with somebody is like, you see them. And so it's like, she didn't even see you. I've also seen this in how people get into college.
You mean like they can just get into college just because they have like a certain last name, or they're related to someone, or they know someone that's at that college already?
Oh man, I have the perfect conversation. So remember whenever we were on our vacation and we were on our way to ride the ATVs, and we were listening to that guy talk about his girlfriend and like how, there were so many things wrong with that conversation. It was insane, but some of the things that he alluded to was, oh, well, we're poor. Like, I thought we were poor, but we're really not. Like, my parents only spent like $200,000 on their house, like, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like thinking, that's a lot of money to some people. That's a really nice house. You probably from like Podunk in the middle of Texas, nowhere, thinking that $200,000 is a shit ton of money. And it is, but it's it's just a little weird that that's just like what you think is poor. So I've also seen, even moving here, like we were told that the area that we live in is going to be real ghetto. And I was like, what do you mean by ghetto? Because like that doesn't make any sense to me. And so we got here and we moved to this area that they were talking about. And I was like, what the hell are they talking about? Like, you must have some white privilege to say something like that if you think that this is ghetto, because you should see where Brandon comes from, because like this ain't nothing. This is nothing. This is fine. Like, just like, it's just like the lack of exposure or knowledge, and like to say something that's so out of sorts. It's not like an educated statement. It's just like a very bias or prejudice that you have about this place because of the group of people that live here. And this is a very diverse area. I love that about this place that we live. And so it was those are the best examples, but there's a lot of good examples, unless you want to elaborate like just for like 15 seconds about what white privilege can look like.
Yeah, it's just like this idea that you're benefiting from something that you didn't necessarily have to work for. And then you kind of turn around and you talk to people who, don't have that resource, but are like trying to get that resource. Oh, well, you need to work harder. Like, wait a minute. You didn't work hard for the blessings and the rights and like
and the
privileges
respect.
that you
I was
have.
gonna say, respect is also something that you can have privilege for, because, like I said, Brandon being treated differently at the checkout line than me. That is a very good example of white privilege.
Yeah, or like
because I had it and you didn't.
Right. Or like having to do a bit extra just to get the same position. Like as a black person, I have to work a bit harder for those positions because of like I didn't have like that respect and dignity and like notoriety handed down to me. Like that's not fair. But my white counterparts, which I understand, like you didn't ask to inherit it, but you did. It's still privilege. So yeah.
I also want to just highlight quickly these definitions of gentrification and redlining. And gentrification is the process of renovating and improving a house or district so that it conforms to middle class taste. So that is, Black Bottom is again a really good example of that, where there was all these black people crammed into this area, and then the white people got to live in these nice houses. And then redlining is to refuse a loan or insurance to someone because they live in an area deemed to be a poor financial risk. I didn't know what that meant until I looked it up today, to be honest.
Yep.
Still learning.
Yeah, but I think it speaks to just like systemic ways in which people in power can be unfair and like separate from people they don't quote unquote believe should be there or don't have the right to be there. I think another, pair of terms, and you've heard me mention this before, is this idea of like overt versus covert communication. And so overt communication is communication that is done openly. It's understood between like both parties that are involved or all the parties that are involved. Like there's no secrets or hidden agendas or hidden meaning behind like what's communicated. So when I turn to my wife and I say, hey, babe, I love you. Like there's a clear meaning there. Like that's overt communication of like, babe, I am in love with you. And it's understood because even as I'm saying it now, she's turning red and she's blinking at me like kind of like that princess blink, like ding, 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 ding.
Oh, come on.
But then there's like covert communication, which is like an opposite in a way, but not really. So like what's communicated, whether that's by voice or by emotion or whatever, isn't readily known or readily like apparent like between like all parties involved. And so again, kind of a situation where I can look at my wife and I can wink at her. Like what could that possibly mean? And unless we both have determined the meaning of like what that wink means, like that's covert communication. It's a way to kind of like hide what you're really trying to say to like outsiders. And I see that a lot when it comes to like, blacks and whites in general, in a sense of like what I mentioned before, like code switching. So, especially being in situations where, especially for me as a black person, I believe that I have to like try to create this sense of like, you don't have to consider me a threat. You might notice that like my diction and like my inflections and all that might change because I'm trying to, make this perception that I'm a part of you. And so like that changes when I'm within groups of people that I'm comfortable with, say my family, or if I'm just, chilling out with my wife, you notice there's a different diction, there's a different way of like saying words, like there's a laxness to it. And that covertly communicates like, okay, we chill, like I can let my guard down with you. And I think one more term to kind of keep in mind, and I think it's one that I'm particularly sensitive to, is this idea of cultural appropriation. So it's this idea that you're taking or using things from a culture that's not your own, and you do so without really showing that you understand or respect that culture. So it's almost like someone patents this idea, right? They get it patent, and then someone comes behind them, like takes that idea, twists it in some sort of way, adds their flair to it, but like doesn't pay respect to the person that originally patented that at all. Or, when it comes to like schoolwork, right? Someone writes an idea, they publish it, it's theirs. But then you come behind them and you claim all the things that they said is your own without giving them credit. So like that in a way can be like cultural appropriation. And a good example of that is the Harlem Shake. Now, some of you, when I mentioned that, probably thought of like the most recent videos and stuff where, they play some song like Con los terroristas. And do the Harlem Shake.
And then I had never heard this version.
This is Harlem. This is the real Harlem Shake.
Oh my God. Is that Kid Weez?
This was big to me.
Yeah, so the original Harlem Shake dance in and of itself originated in Harlem. And it was very like calculated movements. Like there was a rhythm and a cadence and like a swagger to it. Whereas the new Harlem Shake, I gotta be honest, kind of looks like people just randomly gyrating on the screen to some good music. And so I would deem that cultural appropriation because this new Harlem Shake seemingly doesn't pay respect to the original Harlem Shake that was out there, because that's not the Harlem Shake. I refuse to accept it. The devil is a lie.
The devil is a lie.
So yeah, I mean, just right off the bat, we're already seeing that just between two people, just between like two different races, like especially between whites and blacks, like this idea of cultural humility, like the lack of it, really plays a part into why these conversations, I feel like, don't happen as often. There's not a willingness to genuinely learn about the other, to sit there and listen and to like accept people as they are. And to honor that. But then to also do that for yourself too, and then like open yourself up, therefore like creating that accountability between the two of you, which I would call a relationship. So that's something that prevents people from having these conversations. And then, of course, more obvious reasons, biases that you might have towards each other, stereotypes, prejudices, assumptions. And then you top that off with, just kind of rigid standards, rigid beliefs, a non-willingness to change, essentially. Like, you're just so stuck in your beliefs that, like, nothing will change for you. I think it's helpful then to kind of transition into more of, like, these sources of pain that I feel like kind of perpetuate some of the things that I talked about earlier, why we don't necessarily have these conversations. And so there's some things that we're going to talk about, terms that you may or may not be familiar with, but we want to kind of like have a conversation about these.
We want to share these terms because this is what you're going to hear a lot when you have these conversations with people. You're going to hear this on educational videos. You're going to hear this in books and current culture and social studies. Education for me was probably the hardest thing to do. And so knowing these terms is going to maybe trigger something in you, especially if you're white and you've never heard these before, or if you're just unsure about this conversation in general. This is a safe space. So we're going to share with you the terms, what they mean, and maybe an experience or two that reflect that definition. Maybe some experiences from our own life, and then some experiences in just the real world in general. So the first one, I'm going to talk about this first. White fragility. Woo! This is one of those that is uncomfortable to figure out what it is and how it is. So white fragility is defined as discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. So we already can feel it, can't we? We're having this conversation. We don't know how to have this conversation. Maybe you're feeling some gut feelings in your stomach or in your heart, or even in your head. You're starting to get a headache, or you're starting to sweat. Your heart's starting to pound a little bit more because you might be getting defensive. Well, I'm not racist. I don't see color. That's an example of what white I can't even say it, of what white fragility is. And so I'm going to go into that with white panic. So white panic, where I found moral panic. So just think of this in the terms of white people. So a moral panic is a feeling of fear spread among a large number of people that some evil threatens the well-being of society. A dictionary of sociology defines a moral panic as, quote, the process of arousing social concern over an issue, usually the work of moral entrepreneurs in the mass media. So you can see this today. White panic is very evident in the way that some news outlets and people of white supremacy, I guess the people that think that white people are supreme over people of color, there's lots of language that is used around this. And there's also, so I told the story about Reagan in our last episode. You should definitely go check that out, about how he basically he brought in cocaine to the United States to fund money to get rid of a group of people outside of the United States. So that is something, he used that as a crutch to the black community. So he spread those weapons as well. So there was a black market that started thanks to Rick Ross. And just the silliness of politics and how that can be. You can tell how much I love politics. I don't love it. The story of Jackie Robinson is a classic example of how whiteness obscures racism by rendering white privilege, and racist institutions invisible. Robinson is often celebrated as the first African American to break the color line and play in Major League Baseball. While Robinson was certainly an amazing baseball player, this storyline depicts him as racially special, a black man who broke the color line himself. The subtext is that Robinson finally had what it took to play with whites, as if no black athlete before him was strong enough to compete at that level. Imagine instead if the story went something like this. Jackie Robinson, the first black man whites allowed to play Major League Baseball. This version makes a critical distinction because no matter how fantastic a player Robinson was, he simply could not play in major leagues if whites, who control the institution, did not allow it. Were he to walk onto the field before being granted permission by white owners and policymakers, the police would have removed him.
Because the predominant people in control were white, they got to say what goes and what doesn't. And so already from the get-go, you have this experience of privilege, you have this experience of systemic racism, you just have so much going on. And even to this day, it still continues to happen, that for whatever reason, the white opinion is privileged. And so it kind of creates this illusion that, oh yeah, if blacks can just do what we're doing, then they'll be fine. When in reality, that's not the case. I mean, look at the numbers. A lot of the positions are going away, people, especially those positions of power. Why, do you ask? You tell me.
That kind of leads into my topic of institutions and even white supremacy. So race scholars use the term white supremacy to describe a socio-political economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefits those defined and perceived as white. This system of structural power privileges centralizes and elevates white people as a group. If, for example, we look at the racial breakdown of the people who control our institutions, we're seeing telling numbers. As of 2016 and 2017, 10 of the richest Americans are 100% white. U.S. Congress is 90% white. And as of today, U.S. Congress is 22% people of color and then 78% white. So things have changed in the last 2 years, which is great. And then U.S. governors are 96% white. Top military advisors are 100% white. The president and vice president are white. U.S. House Freedom Caucus is white. The presidential cabinet is 91% white. People who decide which TV shows we see are 93% white. People who decide which books we read are 90% white. People who decide which news is covered is 80% white. People who decide which music is produced, 95% white. People who directed the 100 top grossing films of all time worldwide are 95% white. Teachers are 82% white. Full-time college professors are 84% white. And owners of men's professional football teams are 97% white. So also I wanted to elaborate that the nation's population as of 2017 is that there are 62% white people. So the number is going down, but representation does not match.
So we've talked a lot up to this point about like our experience with racism as a couple, our experience, as a black person, your experience as a white person. We've talked about things that kind of stifle these conversations, like keep them from happening, whether that's just stuff that's happening within us or between us, things like bias, stereotype, that sort of thing. We've talked about a lot, but I think the biggest question that a lot of people at least ask me is like, what do we do about it? Like, how do we solve this issue? Like, what is it that I need to be doing? The first thing that comes to mind for me is straight up education. Like education. Like, take some time to really get to know what's going on. I mean, for instance, if I were to ask you, like, what did Crips originally stand for? Like, could you tell me? Like, it originally stood for Community Revolutionary Inter-Party Service, and they were meant to, like, protect their communities. Whereas you might know Crips today as, you know, a gang that, like, rivals the Bloods. Do some educating, like, get to know, like, the important facts, like, get to know the important events, get to know the impact and the effect of those events. Like, don't just simply accept things for the way they are just because, like, someone from an older generation, like, told you and that's the way it is. And so you just, like, did it without necessarily questioning it. Like, get the facts, like, educate yourselves.
I would also say that you can educate yourself on the cultural appropriation that you might be participating in. And I say this around the latest of MLK Day, which maybe you read my beautiful poem on Instagram if you follow me on That Vegan Wife, but if you didn't, it was basically about knowing the context of which you are talking about the things that you're talking about, and not just cherry picking information from Black leaders from the past to make a point in your statement. Because there are a lot of people that like to do that and they don't look at the whole picture of what these Black leaders were saying. And it just becomes this nasty cherry picking battle.
I think another thing to consider is this idea of submission. And I don't mean this idea of like, oh, one person is weaker than the other. It's this idea of making the other important, like lifting them up, making sure that their needs are taken care of. And I think this goes for Black and white people just universally, in a sense of, as human beings, we should like seek to serve one another, whether that's in deed, whether that's in act, whether that's in word. Like, we should be seeking to serve each other. And I say that because if that process is happening, then that means that we're confronting these issues of like systemic racism. That means we're confronting these issues of racism in general, whether that's, you know, classisms or cultural appropriation, whether that's covert racism that you might see, whether that's, you know, in conversation that bias or stereotype comes up. Like, we're confronting those things rather than just not confronting them or like not considering them important or just kind of hiding behind the wayside. Like, that doesn't help us to serve each other. I think part of that service is like protecting each other in that sense too. And so when you see that injustice or you see that stereotype being like passed around, like a way you can submit to one another and serve one another is to call that out.
Simple as that.
Now, I say call it out, but I don't mean be nasty about it. I think that's another kind of rut that we run into, whether that's out of defensiveness or this idea of just having an aggressive attitude out of protection of yourself, whatever you want to call it. As you're calling those things out, as you're serving one another, as you're lifting one another up, making sure their needs are taken care of, that they're heard, there's got to be a gentle accountability with it too. So like, if you do see that injustice, like don't call them out a name or like make them feel less than. Like, point out the mistake, but also like provide a way in which you can help them to be better. When you know better, you do better. So
most of the time. At least we hope you would do better.
Right. And so like with that gentle accountability, like you're pointing out the mistake, yes. You're letting them know what they did wrong. But you're also participating in the healing and like the correction part too.
Building bridges.
Like building bridges rather than just like, oh, well, you're stupid for not knowing that sort of thing.
Can I close this whole thing out with a quote that's very direct? And it's from a white author who wrote White Fragility, and her name is Robin Diangelo. This is what she says when this question is asked to her about how do we solve this? She says, "When white people ask me what to do about racism and white fragility, the first thing I ask is, what has enabled you to be a full, educated, professional adult and not know what to do about racism? It is a sincere question. How have we managed not to know, especially when the information is all around us? When people of color have been telling us for years. If we take that question seriously and map out all the ways we have come to not know what to do, we will have our guide before us. For example, if my answer is that I was not educated about racism, I know that I will have to get educated. If my answer is that I don't know people of color, I will need to build relationships. If it is because there are no people of color in my environment, I will need to get out of my comfort zone and change my environment. Addressing racism is not without effort. Boom. Mic drop. Probably the most direct, accurate statement to that. I'm going to say this phrase because I like this phrase. Ignorance is a choice. We have smartphones in our hands. We have social media. There are plenty of people on social media that are being active in this community and making voices known. I'm going to list some of my influencers that I follow that talk about this issue. So let's do that in the description. Anything else we need to say about this topic? I feel like this is a good way to close it.
Yeah, but also keep in mind, I mean, outside of social media, which is important, turn to one another, like actually talk with one another. Yes, it's a vulnerable conversation. Yes, it's a hard conversation, but it is so worth it to have. I mean, some of my best relationships have come from having conversations like these. And while they're hard, like they create an intimacy and like a closeness and like a camaraderie that I really can't like make sense of. You just have to feel it. You just have to be a part of it. And I feel like the more and more people get involved in those kind of conversations, as hard as they may be, like I imagine a way better and gentler and accepting world where for once, like we can actually feel closer as people rather than just continuously dividing.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg of this conversation. I just wanted to reiterate because there are so many other things that we could talk about, but we don't want to overwhelm you. So if you have questions, please find us on Peas in Progress on Instagram. You can also email us at peasinprogress@gmail.com.
Yeah, we definitely welcome any kind of questions, and we would love to be able to walk alongside you in your journey as well. So like any way that we can be helpful, you just let us know. Definitely reach out. And of course, if you have any questions or comments about things that we've talked about, do feel free to ask us those or share those as well. We are both open to having those conversations and open that pathway to dialogue. So yeah, let us know what you think.
And subscribe.
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 Like I have to burp.
Let it out.
I don't even know what the
hell was that?
I was trying to put something.
It sounded like a struggling velociraptor or something.